There are gods whose names echo through history. Gods of storms, gods of war, gods whose temples towered over cities and whose stories survived for thousands of years. And then there are the forgotten ones, the quiet deities, the names half buried in broken clay tablets and fading fragments of ancient language. Deities whose worship once mattered deeply to the people who knew them, but whose stories were nearly swallowed by time. Tonight's goddess is one of those figures, a minor Mesopotamian deity from the ancient city of Kisiga, a woman known simply as Nunusdug. Her name means the good woman. It sounds gentle, almost comforting, but the world she existed within was anything but gentle. Nunusdug emerged during one of the earliest periods of organized civilization in human history, a time before empires ruled Mesopotamia, before Babylon rose to power, before many of the myths we now associate with the region had fully formed. The world she belonged to was ancient, even by ancient standards. Cities were beginning to grow beside rivers. Writing itself was still developing. Religion shaped every part of life, from politics to agriculture to survival. And somewhere among those early city-states, people prayed to a goddess called the Good Woman. Who was she? Why did she matter? And what does it mean when a deity survives history only in fragments? Tonight, witches and wanderers, we travel back to the cradle of civilization itself. Hello, witches and wanderers, and welcome back to the Morbid Witch Podcast, where we explore myths, folklore, legends, and the darker corners of history and belief. I'm your host, Kari. Each episode, we step into stories that connect humanity to the divine, the supernatural, and the unknown. Some tales survive through massive epics and famous gods. Others survive only through scattered references, damaged tablets, and names nearly erased by time. And tonight's episode belongs to one of those quieter stories, because Nunusdug is not a goddess most people recognize. She does not appear in modern films or popular mythology books. There are no massive surviving myths centered entirely around her. Instead, she exists in pieces, small mentions preserved through archaeology and scholarship. But sometimes, those smaller stories reveal just as much about the ancient world as the larger legends do. If you're new here, welcome. And if you're returning, it's always good to have you back. To all my witches and wanderers, thank you for being here and continuing to support the show. Every listen, every comment, every rating, and every shared episode helps keep this strange little corner of storytelling alive. I truly appreciate every single one of you spending your time here with me. Before we begin, just a quick reminder. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to rate the show. Those small actions really help more witches and wanderers find their way here. You can listen to the Morbid Witch Podcast on Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and Pandora. Now, let's travel back to ancient Mesopotamia. To understand Nunusdug, we first need to understand the world she came from. She was worshipped during what historians call the Early Dynastic period of Mesopotamia. This era lasted roughly from around 2900 BCE to 2350 BCE, long before the famous rise of empires like Babylon or Assyria. During this time, Mesopotamia was not a unified kingdom. Instead, it was made up of independent city-states scattered across the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These cities were among the earliest urban centers in human history. Places like Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and many others became hubs of trade, religion, and political power. Each city had its own rulers, its own patron deities, and its own cultural identity. Rivalries between cities were common, and warfare frequently erupted over land, resources, and influence. Yet despite this instability, civilization itself was rapidly advancing. Writing systems, laws, agriculture, and organized religion all continued to develop during this period. The people of Mesopotamia wrote using cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems ever created. Scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets, recording everything from trade agreements to hymns and myths. Much of what we know about ancient Mesopotamian religion survives because of these tablets. Without them, many gods, including Nunusdug, would have disappeared completely from memory. Religion during the Early Dynastic period was deeply woven into daily life. Gods were not distant concepts. They were believed to directly influence crops, weather, health, war, and political authority. Temples served as religious centers, economic centers, and political institutions all at once. Priests and priestesses held significant influence, and maintaining favor with the gods was considered essential for survival. This was the world Nunusdug existed within, a world where every city had divine protectors, a world where even smaller gods held meaning within their communities, and a world where being remembered at all was a kind of immortality. Nunusdug was associated with the city of Kisiga, though very little survives about the city itself. This is one of the difficulties of studying ancient Mesopotamia. Some cities left behind vast records and monumental architecture. Others survive only in fragments, mentioned briefly in damaged text or archaeological references. Kisiga belongs more to the second category. It existed. It mattered to the people who lived there. And yet, much of its story has been lost. And still, one thing remains clear. The people of Kisiga worship Nunusdug. Her name translates roughly to the Good Woman, a title that immediately raises questions. What did good mean within this context? Was she associated with kindness, fertility, protection, wisdom, or moral order? Ancient Mesopotamian names often reflected both personality and divine function, but unfortunately, there are very few surviving texts that explain Nunusdug directly. Instead, scholars must piece together meaning from limited references and cultural context. In Mesopotamian religion, even minor gods often held extremely important local roles. A deity might not be widely known across the entire region, but could still be central to one city's identity. Nunusdug may have been exactly that, a deeply meaningful goddess to the people of Kisiga, even if history later overshadowed her with larger deities like Inanna, Enlil, and Enki. There is something strangely haunting about this idea. Entire communities once built rituals, prayers, and offerings around gods whose names are now barely remembered. People lived and died believing these deities protected them. Festivals were likely held in Nunusdug's honor. Temples may have stood in her name. Songs may have been sung to her beneath torchlight thousands of years ago. And now, only fragments remain. But those fragments still matter, because they remind us that history is not only shaped by the famous, it is also shaped by the forgotten. Modern discussions in mythology often focus on major deities. We remember the gods with grand myths, because those narratives survive in larger numbers. But ancient religions were much more complex than simple pantheons led by a handful of important figures. Mesopotamian religion included hundreds, perhaps even thousands of gods and spirits. Some ruled entire cosmic forces, while others governed highly localized aspects of life. Minor gods often acted as intermediaries between larger divine powers and ordinary people. They could be associated with specific cities, rivers, professions, or even individual temples. Their importance was not measured by how widely they were known, but by how deeply they were woven into the lives of communities that worshipped them. Nunusdug may have been one of these localized deities, a goddess whose influence remained closely tied to Kisiga and its people. This reflects something important about ancient spirituality. Religion in Mesopotamia was deeply practical. People prayed for rain, fertile soil, healthy children, protection from illness, and victory in conflict. Gods were part of everyday survival. Even smaller deities could become deeply beloved if they were seen as protectors of the community. The title Good Woman may suggest that Nunusdug represented stability and benevolence within that environment. While we cannot say for certain what her exact functions were, the name itself implies positive qualities. And in a world filled with uncertainty, a protective or nurturing goddess would have held tremendous emotional significance. There's also something deeply human about the way minor gods fade from history. As empires rise and cultures shift, certain stories dominate while others disappear. Temples crumble, languages change, records are destroyed, and eventually only traces remain. But those traces still whisper. And if we listen closely enough, sometimes we can still hear them. Before we continue, witches and wanderers, let's pause for just a moment. Thank you for being here and spending your time with the Morbid Witch Podcast. Whether you're listening late at night, relaxing at home, or driving somewhere under the night sky, I truly appreciate every one of you. This show continues because of your support, your curiosity, and your love for strange and forgotten stories. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I always love hearing your thoughts and seeing which stories resonate most with you. And if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to rate the show. You can listen to the Morbid Witch Podcast on Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and Pandora. Now, let's return to ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian mythology included many powerful female deities. Some represented love and war, others fertility, wisdom, motherhood, or destruction. Goddesses often reflected the realities and anxieties of the societies that worshipped them. Through them, people explained natural cycles, political authority, and emotional experiences. Nunusdug existed within this broader tradition of feminine divine power. However, unlike goddesses such as Inanna, Nunusdug did not leave behind dramatic myths of conquest or cosmic struggle. Instead, her identity appears quieter. Her very name centers goodness rather than domination or fear. That alone makes her stand out in an ancient world where divine power was often expressed through violence or overwhelming authority. The phrase, good woman, may have carried layers of meaning beyond morality. In Mesopotamian society, Ideas of order, care, ritual purity, and protection were all highly valued. Nunusdug may have embodied some combination of those qualities. She may have been viewed as a stabilizing presence within her city, a goddess connected to harmony rather than chaos. There is also something deeply symbolic about the survival of her name. We may not know her stories in detail, but the fact that she was remembered at all tells us she mattered. Someone carved her name into clay. Someone preserved it through ritual and prayer. Someone believed she deserved to endure. And thousands of years later, she still does. There is a strange melancholy attached to forgotten deities. Once, Nunusdug would have existed within a living religious tradition. People would have spoken her name regularly. People would have grown up hearing stories connected to her temple. Offerings may have been left at shrines in hopes of protection or blessing. And yet, over time, those voices disappeared. Civilizations collapsed. Languages faded. Temples were abandoned. And eventually, entire gods slipped into obscurity. But mythology has a remarkable way of surviving, even in fragments. A single clay tablet can preserve a name for thousands of years. One archaeological discovery can reconnect the modern world to beliefs long thought lost. And through scholarship, storytelling, and curiosity, figures like Nunusdug continue to exist in some form. There's something almost ghostly about that. These ancient gods survive not as living religions for most people, but as echoes. Fragments of thought preserved across unimaginable stretches of time. They remind us that history is filled not only with conquerors and kings, but also with ordinary people trying to understand the world around them. And perhaps that is why stories like this matter, because even forgotten gods were once loved. Thank you for listening to the Morbid Witch Podcast, and thank you to all my witches and wanderers for continuing to support the show. Every listen, every rating, every comment, and every share helps keep these stories alive. I truly appreciate every one of you for spending your time here with me. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, make sure you're following the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and Pandora. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to rate the show. Until next time, stay strange, stay spooky, and remember, the shadows are always watching.